Today we're going to continue in our series on Made for More. Pastor Renee kicked it off last week talking about salt and light. And so we're going to get into that this morning. But before we start the message, would you stand with me? Let's read the word of the Lord this morning. Our teaching text is going to be out of the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, and starting in verse 17. And we can read this together. Starting in verse 17. Here we go. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separate from their life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Amen? Amen. You may be seated. I don't know about you. Maybe you did or did not, but how many of you remember the 1993 film Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray? I don't know I haven't watched it in a while, so I'm sorry if I shouldn't be saying this from the pulpit, okay? But you remember that 1993 movie, Bill Murray, Groundhog Day. He plays a weatherman who reluctantly is sent to Puxatawney, Pennsylvania to cover the Groundhog's Day event. If you don't know what Groundhog's Day is, it comes I think it's February 2nd every year. And essentially the kind of, it's really a cultural mythology that the groundhog will come out if he sees his shadow as he goes back in. I don't know the way it actually works, but either he predicts an early spring or a long winter. And so this movie takes place in this little town of Puxatawney, Pennsylvania, where the famous Puxatawney Phil is the groundhog who will basically summon the spring or prolong the winter. And so Bill Murray goes to this town, kind of just gosh, what a lame assignment. And he goes to the town of Puxatawney. He wakes up in the morning. He covers the festivities with as much pomp and circumstance as trash day in Manhattan. Just no excitement there. And he goes in and he lives the day out, and he's just kind of got a terrible attitude about it. He goes to bed. He wakes up the next day, and it's the same day over again. And this goes on through the movie. Every day, he plays out the day every time, and he goes through all of these different things. He lives every day. No matter what he does, he tries to leave the town and drive as far as he can, and yet he wakes up the next day. It's Groundhog's Day. He does all these types of things. You can watch the movie or don't watch the movie, I don't know. But he relives this day, and there's this question he has. He's hanging out with some locals at the bowling alley, and he turns to them and he asks them this question. He says, "What would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing you did matter?" And one of the small town gentlemen says, "Well, that sounds about right." His life seems to be the same, even though maybe it's not Groundhog's Day every day. But it's interesting is Phil's response to that question in this movie goes from kind of a frustration to kind of hedonism. He just kind of does whatever he wants. He feels like punching somebody in the face. He just does it because who cares? It's the next day is going to come. And it goes from this kind of hedonism to rage to lunacy to self-harm, and eventually kind of comes to this place of self-acceptance and self-improvement. But that question he asks himself is at the root of so much in our world and in our own lives, is oftentimes we will find ourselves in places and ask ourselves, does anything really matter? Maybe you ask that question, maybe not because maybe you do feel the mundanity of life just seems to be going nowhere, and maybe you do feel that way. Or maybe you feel stuck, like there's just something going on and you can't get past it, and it feels like you're reliving the same thing or the same frustrations or same struggles. Maybe you're stuck at a point of wounding and trauma that you just can't seem to get past. And you ask, man, is this really what all life is going to be, is just struggle? Maybe you found yourself disappointed, that you've prayed and sought God. We sang these wonderful songs of praise and trust in God. And maybe there was part of you this morning that goes, I sought the Lord, and I don't know if I've heard that answer. And maybe you sang it, or maybe you didn't sing it because it's a place of pain. You go, really? Does it really matter? Does prayer really matter? Maybe you're at a point where you're disillusioned with your faith, disillusioned with life even. And you feel this sense of like, where is there a sense of purpose? Maybe you're discouraged by things and you just feel down and you just can't seem to get your head to look up enough. And it just seems like there is no purpose to that life. Or maybe you're here and you are struggling with doubt. You're struggling with what is true and what is not true, or what's going on in the faith, and you find yourself asking that same question, does this really matter? Whether it's about your faith or life, whether it's about the future that you thought you'd have or that you hope you'd had, maybe at some point we ask ourselves that question, and at some level we are asking that question, why am I here? Why try when maybe nothing else changes? Maybe we ask the question is, what is the point? See, the reality is that God created you and I not just to live a meaningless life. You know, that so much that we see, and you look at much of our own day and age is ruled by a value pattern and thought pattern that really leads to this idea of nihilism, that nothing really matters. That we're here, and so much of our materialistic, or not just materialistic from like a wanting things thing, but scientifically, like this idea that everything that exists is all that exists, and that you come to this world and then you die, and it seems to be this life that really, when you boil it down, doesn't seem to have purpose. But yet God created you and I not to live a purposeless life, but to live a life of purpose. From the very beginning, you go back to Genesis, and in the book of Genesis, God creates all of existence. It says he doesn't just create the earth. It says he creates the heavens and the earth. You know that if you look at a telescope today and look into the far reaches of space, that it continues to expand because God's active creation, like him himself, is ongoing and continuous. That we look at God begins to create all things in existence from the very beginning. And in this moment of creation, he creates this land, this place, the earth. And in the earth, it says that he separates the seas, the sea below, the sea above, the sky and the sea. He populates them with fish and with birds. He raises up land and populates it with animals. And he populates it with trees and vegetation. And he creates all of this beautiful world. And then in the midst of saying each day this is good, the last day he comes and he says, hey, I'm going to create something unique and something special. He created the birds, he created the fish, he's created the livestock and the animals, he created beautiful plants and landscapes around the world, but there was something still missing. And he turns and he says, I'm going to create something. He says, let us create man in our own image. And it says this in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. I want you to listen to this. We were created with a purpose. Why were we created? Not merely to be a likeness of God, but it says this, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over the creatures that move along the ground. Why were you and I created? You and I were created not merely to exist, not merely to just survive, but we were created to rule. We were created to govern, to rule over this earth. That we might rule over what God had created, that we would represent God into the whole of creation. And God created man, and here's what he designed you and I to do. To live out this purpose in our lives. In fact, if you just zoom in a little bit, it says this, and he kind of says, hey, our purpose is to rule, and this is what ruling looks like. And it says in verse 26, God blessed them. So he blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and the sky and every living creature that moves on the ground. There's a twofold purpose that God gives all man. He gives man. This is the very beginning of creation. He creates us to rule by filling the earth and subduing it. Now, this idea of filling the earth is more than just like go and make babies and populate this land that I made. This is not a strategy to populate creation, build societies and civilizations. What God is really saying is that not just to fill the earth, but you understand he created us in his image, and he wants to spread his image across his creation. That is this idea that not just to fill the earth with just people so that they may live and die, but that we could fill the earth with God's people, that they may represent his image across the earth. And then there's a second part, subdue the earth. Now, you might say, well, he tells us to rule, so we'll rule. This is not the same as rule, what we read, right? We're called to rule over the earth, but ruling involves filling it. But to subdue the earth is not just to like be in charge. In fact, the Hebrew root here is kavash, and that root, it is a verb, and it is a rather violent verb. It's a verb that literally means to subjugate and violate. I mean, that does not sound nice and pretty, doesn't it? To subjugate and violate. To literally, what he's saying is to transform the earth by binding it against its own will into man's own will. Obviously reflecting God, right? So here, image, what is it saying? Well, it's reflecting back. If you look back at the very beginning, it says that there was chaos over the waters. And God speaks order into the chaos. I want you to know something. Did you know that order and chaos are opposites, right? And what does God do? He subdues the chaos. He violates the will of chaos and brings order out of the place of chaos. You hear what I'm saying? And here what God is doing is he is literally commissioning mankind, you and I, not merely to go populate, but to take the earth and to bend its own will into the will of those who are meant to represent God. You tracking with me? So this is modeled in how God begins to interact with the first humans. Now, remember, God creates the heavens and the earth. So he creates everything. He creates the heavens, he creates the earth, and then in the earth, on all of the land, now we believe he didn't just create one little section of the earth, he created the entirety of the globe. He creates the entirety of the globe, he brings up earth, he does all of these things, and yet here, as he does this, he creates in this land a place called Eden. Okay, so you hear, right? It's like in the world there's a nation, and in the nation there's a state, and in the state there's a town, and in the town there's a street, and in the street there's a house. God created the entirety of the globe, but yet there's one place that he decides to call Eden. It's this place that is unique. It says that God created the heavens and the earth, but here when it talks about the garden, you can go back and read, it says that God planted a garden in the middle of Eden. God didn't, what does that mean? I don't know what it looks like in particular, but here's what it's saying is that there's a specific place that God created to be this cradle for man. And in this place is where he chooses to place Adam and Eve. It was here in this garden in a land called Eden that was just this one place amongst all the earth that was a place of perfect union where they could walk and talk with the Lord and they could work and tend to the garden, not out of labor, but out of love. Here is this picture of Eden literally means paradise, and the garden is this pristine place. And in the middle of the garden, God places two trees, a tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A tree that if they eat of the tree of life, they will have eternal or everlasting life. And if they eat of the tree of knowledge, it will bring death. A tree of life and a tree of death. Here in the midst of this garden. And it's here in this place where Adam and Eve begin to live out their purpose alongside God. They were meant to fill the earth. They were never meant to stay in Eden. And we could go and I could spend way more time than you're going to want to sit here talking about all this stuff because I think it's awesome and I love it. But even the imagery, out of Eden, there's a river that splits to 4 rivers. Because here's the deal. What God meant to do was never meant to stay in Eden, but to flow into all the earth. The commission never went to Adam and Eve and said, okay, you just enjoy your life here in the garden and stay here. It was always to go forth, fill the earth, and subdue it. See, outside of Eden, there was still chaos. Outside the garden, there was still a harshness that was there. And yet, here in the garden, Adam and Eve were meant to fill the earth, to literally fill the earth with God's people, and to subdue the earth into Eden itself. You tracking with me? This is our purpose. This was what we were planned and created to do, to go and bring the vision of God not merely into one place, but into all the earth. To bind the chaotic, wild land, to bring Eden into the world, into the places, to bring life, right? To bring that life that they partook in the tree of life, that bring life into the world. That is what was embodied in every human. That's why when you look at, you want to know why do not civilizations only live like in places that are easy to live? Why do we build aqueducts that take water from a good source and bring it into an arid place? Because we were meant to subdue the earth, to bring life into places where there was no life. That's why we build cities, we plant gardens, because there is something in our purpose to bring forth life and God's vision. But what happens? Well, the reality is that though God had a purpose and a plan, he also knew that in order for man to fulfill and walk in this, they had to have free will. That's why there's 2 trees in the garden. And here in the place that Adam and Eve, you can look at it in Genesis 3, they go to this tree, and we've talked about it, and you can go look. But what happens here is mankind, Adam and Eve, go to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they take that which they took, and as an act of defiance, didn't take what God had for them, but decided to take things into their own hands. As an act of defiance, Adam and Eve began to eat the fruit, not of life, but the tree whose fruit is death. It says they eat it. And this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there they eat it. And I want you to see there's these 2 trees, right? The tree that leads to life and a tree that leads to death. And so what happens in that moment is they bring death into the world. Where they were once called to go forth and bring life into all, to subdue the earth and bring forth life into all the earth. What have they done instead is they take death and they bring death into the world. Cycles of violence, cycles of death and despair. And so they bring upon this death not merely into their own selves and all of humanity, but they bring death into the world and all creation itself. And I want you to look at what the curse is that this is. Now I want you to hear something. This is not God saying, I'm mad at you, so this is the curse. This is the fruit when we eat the fruit of the tree of death, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When we eat the tree of defiance, when we eat upon our own, take things on our own terms. Well, what is the consequence? Here's what happens. In Genesis 3:16, he turns to the woman and says, I will make your pains and childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. We could go into lots of things, but I want you to notice, we were created to be fruitful and multiply. God is not taking purpose away, but now, because they've found themselves outside of God's grace, being fruitful and multiply comes through severe pain. We know historically it comes through often the cost of life itself. And then he turns to Adam and he says, because you listened and ate from the fruit of to your wife and ate from the from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. He says the curse. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from where you were taken. For dust you are, and to the dust you shall return. I want you to notice something. There's pain and toil. There is pain and labor and toil when we try to begin to fulfill our purpose on our own. Here the man is, he's still going to go and try to subdue the earth, but we could build aqueducts, and within a century or two, they will be gone. Right? You see the great empires of this world that have come to subdue the earth, and yet the earth seems to always overcome that over time. Doesn't matter the feats of man, doesn't matter what we may do or how smart or technological we may be, the earth will still come to take it over. We don't have the power will because the earth itself has been cursed. And I want you to notice something, that now mankind, yes, they're going to do this thing, they're going to try on their own, but when they eat the fruit of the ground, they're not eating of the tree of life. What are they eating? They're eating the fruit of the curse. They're eating, it says right there, you will eat food from the ground which God has just cursed. Food from the ground that they begin to, and you'll see that this begins to bring forth. That's why we have cycles of pain and death and violence. You want to know what? Here's the reality. We can't explain away everything that bad that happens in the world. Like God just has a plan. It's not, the gospel doesn't teach this fatalism that says, hey, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes kids have cancer. And can God work through that? Absolutely. But that's not God's plan or God's will. You may find yourself in a place and you're like, man, and maybe somebody even said, like, well, God does everything for a reason. That's not the case. It's because we eat the fruit of the curse. And so the brokenness and the death that came into humanity through sin, it corrupts all creation, even on a cellular level. I'm not here to say that I know exactly how God bridges those things into the cells of our body, but I can tell you that even on a cellular level, sin has entered into humanity, and it is part of what makes us broken. And he ends this with this last thing, that you will labor, you will eat, you will die, and you will return to the dust from which you were created. It's this idea. You'll work, you'll eat, maybe make some babies and die. The picture of sin and the picture of the fall is a picture of futility. I don't know. Sometimes you go to a funeral service, say dust to dust, ashes to ashes. That's not a comforting thing. It points us to the futility of our human existence, how small and our names will be forgotten within a few generations, and yet here we find ourselves, and this is the reality of what sin has done to humanity, is that sin not only brings death into the world, but it brings futility into our lives. That is why we struggle, because we're called to something so high, yet our lives are so futile because of the sin and brokenness in our lives. And we wrestle with this sense. That's why Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he echoes this thing, meaningless, meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1 says, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? And you can keep reading. It's a bunch more of this, like nothing is good. Ecclesiastes is a real, picker-upper of a book, okay? People will quote, I told my dad this morning, people will quote, well, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, there's nothing new nobody ain't handled, honey. Have you ever heard that in church? It's not what that means. It literally means, like, there's nothing new, nothing's good, everything's bad. That's what Solomon is saying here. Well, what is it? It's that sin in the world brings us to this point. It is there. What is the point? Meaningless, meaningless. That when sin rules over us, when sin comes in, because here is the reality, that moment in the garden, and when sin comes into our own lives, what happens is we trade our calling to rule in to be ruled by our sin, to be ruled by the devil. What is that thing? Sin rules over us, and it brings pain, it brings death, and it keeps ruling over us. Why? It creates this cycle, because here is what our lives become. Our purpose, the world's only purpose that the world can offer is this. Here are ways to try to reduce your pain and increase your pleasure. I want you to think about it. How do we find purpose? Well, if there's ways to reduce your pain, Reduce the effects of the curse, and then increase your treasure, increase your pleasure. We live in a world that is governed by that, right? I mean, from the opioid epidemic saying, hey, you know what that starts with? Just numb my pain. Well, all of a sudden, those opioids become not something that you rule over, but rule over you. And all of a sudden, that which was a thing to relieve the pain begins to bring more pain and more suffering, because that's the way sin begins to work. And it's there to increase pleasure. That's the lie the enemy says. That's why in Genesis 3, it says that Eve looks upon the fruit of the tree, and it says in verse 6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She didn't take it because the serpent said, hey, you should eat this. She took it because it looked pleasurable. So much of our lives are governed by what will give us pleasure. And maybe you're like, hey, my life's not very good. We still go after those things. We still try to numb the pain or increase pleasure when we go to the things. I mean, think of that idea, right? That we begin to go and to the things of this world, like addiction, that we go to it to numb our pain. Or maybe we go to it because it makes us feel good and gives us pleasure. But the moment we get that hit, it pulls us back, and we have to go through the cycle again. Even places of desperation. As you struggle with things that go through, what does the world offer? We live in a time where, in a suicide epidemic that is going across generations and genders like it has never done before. And what does suicide offer? Here's a way to just numb the pain. But it brings death. What does the world have to offer? And I mean, even something as simple as I'm guilty of this, right? Like Amazon Prime, right? You see that thing and you're like, I really want that thing. But the thing is, I don't want to wait for that thing. Do you remember when you ordered things online and it took 3 weeks to get here? How awful does that sound? I don't want to wait 3 weeks for that. I want it. It's the funniest thing. I didn't order it, but I almost ordered something last night. We were fixing up my office at the house, and I needed a new power cord, and I was like, hey, I could get this here by 11 o'clock in the morning. Do I need it by 11 o'clock? I'm here right now at 11 o'clock in the morning. I didn't need a power strip, but man, it felt good to know that I could get it by 11 o'clock in the morning. What is it offering? It's offering, hey, you don't have to have the pain. But the moment you get the thing, you want another thing. Right? The moment, maybe it gives you pleasure for a period. We get the dopamine hit and we get what we want. And then all of a sudden, once we get that hit, the next moment that follows that dopamine hit is a sense of emptiness. It makes us that place where we do it, and all of a sudden we just immediately go for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that goes from ordering things on Amazon Prime to genocides that happen throughout the world. It's this increased way to say, hey, if I can take it on my own, if I can live it, that's going to be better for me or better for my people or better for my group or whatever at the expense of others. That is the cycle of sin and death. And that's what leaves us in this place of meaninglessness. And like a drug, sin always seems to get us to come back for more. And it doesn't just impact your life. It doesn't just impact even all of mankind. It impacts all of creation. This is why Paul says in Romans 8, for the creation was subjected to frustration. It says this in Romans 8:20. For creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that creation itself would be liberated, freed from its bondage to decay, and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. The bondage of decay. Death has subdued. Death has ruled over creation. All the earth is longing for something more, longing to be free from the curse, free from the cycles of violence and death that just leads to more and more and more of the same. They want to be free, but here is the good news. You and I were created, we were made for more than that. more than just living in the patterns of the world, the patterns of sin, the patterns of death, the patterns of brokenness. We were created not to bring death and decay into the world, not to bring violence, not to bring whatever the things are that seem to crumble the world around us. We were created to bring life, to take that which God had created in Eden and to bring it into the earth. And so God, with all of creation, we too long for things to be different. I mean, how many of you long for things to be different in your life and in the people around you, right? We long for things to be better. It's not that we long for things to be better, to be different. We all long for purpose. And here is the beauty, that God had a plan. See, just as God created man who was meant to bring Eden into the world, to take that act and to begin to subdue the earth into this place of God's paradise. Jesus comes to this earth. God himself embodied becomes this man. He takes on flesh. And he doesn't just come and get things done and then scoot on to heaven. He comes as a baby. He endures the pain that you and I feel. He even comes not through some amazing descending, but he comes through the pain of childbirth. There is already, you want to know the act of restoration of Jesus does not start on the cross. It starts when all of a sudden the Messiah comes through the pains of childbirth through him. There's a restoration of woman. In fact, you could go back, I won't look at it there, but that God even promises that he's going to bring restoration through the woman, that she will crush the head of the serpent. That here, this moment that Jesus comes to this earth, he endures our weakness and our brokenness. He doesn't sin, he doesn't do those things, but he understands the labors that you have gone through. He's lost people he loved. He's seen oppression at a systematic level. He was not raised by people of means, but raised in poverty. He saw himself in a place and a state that was in brokenness and discouraged, hopelessness, and not a seemingly hope for anything. Yet in the midst of this place, Jesus came out. He came out of it, and not only to do it to bring forth and overthrow the evils of this world by force, thus pushing the same systems of death and violence, but rather that he comes to this place, God living in the flesh, experiencing this cursed world, but yet he did not live a life ruled by sin. Rather, he lived a life where he ruled over creation. Here's the amazing thing. And sometimes we dismiss it because Jesus being God, but yet here Jesus comes, and there's this wonderful story in the Gospels where Jesus is asleep in the boat, and there's a storm that kicks up in the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples are in the boat, and they're like, oh my gosh, how do you sleep through this? There's another earthquake last night. Did anybody wake up to that earthquake last night? I don't know if it's me getting older or having a kid or what. I woke up again. This is a weird thing. I never wake up during earthquakes. There was an earthquake this morning. And you know what? I woke up, and I don't know about you, but the last week we had a pretty big one, and I woke up and I go, did you feel that, Kelsey? And she's like, no. I'm standing in the door jamb, ready for things. I'm actually ready to run into the nursery and get Eden. And I'm waiting. I'll just leave my wife in the bed. I don't know. There's nothing that could fall on her, okay? Well, I'm how could you sleep? And here they are. They're how do you sleep through this storm? And Jesus gets up, and he just rebukes the waves, says, hey, let it go. And this is what the disciple says. Who is this that even the waves obey him? Because here's the thing. Jesus was not ruled by sin. He ruled over creation. He subdued the waves themselves. It's Jesus being the new Adam, coming into the earth, not just staying in his little pocket in heaven, enjoying paradise, enjoying the good life, but coming down to subdue the earth and all creation and to rule over it. Not a rule that comes to violence against us, but to bring forth God's vision. And here in the midst, he did not bring death into the world, but he brought life. And how does he bring life into the world? He dies on a tree that brought death. They raised him on a tree, and he died on that tree. Yet, through Jesus paying the price, this is why Jesus says, or Paul says when he talks about the Lord's Supper, and we take the bread which represents his body, the cup that represents his blood, that we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We're proclaiming that he may have died on the tree, but it's the tree that gives us life. Amen. This is our hope, that he died in this place. And for you this morning, we live on all of these things, and maybe you're here this morning and you just need life. There's a little bit more we're going to read in a second, but I want to tell you, if you're here this morning and you say, hey, I need Jesus, I want you to know that God did not come to bring punishment or condemnation upon the world, but rather to bring life, that you can have life. And so this is what Paul says. In light of what Jesus has done, in light of the work that he has come, that he comes as the new Adam who is not ruled by sin, but rules over all creation, even death itself. He comes and is raised from the dead, meaning that he even rules over death itself. He begins to do something new. And we begin to live in the new thing. Those of us that have accepted and followed Jesus, that you and I, we live in the new thing that Jesus is beginning to do. And it says this in Ephesians chapter 4. This brings us to our teaching text this morning. And we're going to read a little bit longer, so it'll sound familiar. It says this, so I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, the sinners, the people gone, the others, in the futility of their thinking. See, we live a futile life in sin. They are darkened in their understanding and separate from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. I don't know if he's talking about the Ephesians or if he's talking about, Americans in 2024. Really? He's talking about, this is like, okay, take a picture, take a snapshot. They're in ignorance due to their hardening of their hearts. People have a hardened heart. They've lost sensitivity. They've given themselves over to sensuality, to impurity, every kind of impurity. They're full of greed. I mean, let's be really honest. Sensuality, impurity, and greed is what runs our economic system. But Paul says this to you and I. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ. We do not live a life of futility or ignorance. It says that we were taught in him according to with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. You and I no longer live lives of meaninglessness or futility. We no longer live in the cycles of this world or the cycles that sin brings into our lives. That we can put off the old life. Put off the life that is corrupted by eating the fruit of the cursed ground, eating the fruit of sin and brokenness, by eating the fruit of this world. But yet we can now turn and take and eat of the tree of life through Jesus. That we can now partake and enter and have a life through Jesus. But that means that here's the thing. Do you know why Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden? It wasn't like just this punitive system that God says, oh, you broke that rule, so now you got to do that. God says, well, we can't leave them here. They've already eaten of this tree, and if they keep staying here, then they'll eat the tree of life, and they'll live forever, and they will destroy everything. Can you imagine some of the worst people in history living forever? It's hard enough to get people who only live a short lifespan to let go of power. Can you imagine the destruction that humanity would bring? That's why they were cast out. They could no longer eat the tree of life. And here's the thing. You can't have and eat of the tree of this world or the tree of that brings forth death. You can't eat the tree of sin and brokenness and still have the tree of life. It doesn't work that way. So we have to put off our old selves. Does that mean you're not going to struggle? You're going to struggle. There's things that comes up. That's why Paul was writing these words to believers. He's not writing these to non-believers. He's writing these to believers because they're struggling. But he's saying, hey, don't live into the world. Don't live into your own deceitful desires. But begin to take that off and put on the new self. Begin to think about things differently. Begin to think about the way of Jesus. You know, he talks about impurity and he talks about greed. You know the antidote to all sorts of impurities and all sorts of those types of things and greed? Just go read the Sermon on the Mount. Honestly, it's like 3 chapters in Matthew. Just read it. And you go, okay, there's a new way of life that we can live. To no longer live. Read Jesus' teachings on money would radically transform all the economic discouragements and things that happen in our culture and our day-to-day. But we no longer live these futile lives. We become a new self and a new creation. I love that picture. See, Jesus did not come merely to just fix things, put a Band-Aid on our brokenness, and then we just wait till he comes again. It says that you and I are a new creation in Christ. He takes that very act that was in the very beginning of Genesis where God created the earth that we might bring forth his garden into the world. Here, Jesus has established his kingdom, and he says, here, take it to the world and subdue it. That's why Paul says in Corinthians, I love this, chapter 5, verse 17, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. Amen? If anyone is in Christ, if anyone has said, hey, I'm following Jesus, and they confessed it and they believe in their heart and they have chosen to follow Jesus, the new creation has come. That the old has gone. The new is here. All this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ. That means that God has brought us back into that place of relationship with the Father. That picture that Pastor Renee said of just God being able to hug and embrace you. That picture, it says that is not, we're not able to do that because, of a great song or a nice thought. It's because of Jesus through the new creation. He reconciles us to God. And it says and because we have been reconciled to God, it says what? He gives us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ. Not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. That we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. And though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might be the righteousness of God. I know that's a big chunk of scripture there, and there's a lot of stuff there. But I want you to understand the picture. God has reconciled us. What has he done? We're a new creation. He has put us back into the garden. When we come and gather, that sometimes we think of paradise or this idea of heaven is something that you just go to when you die. That's not at all the theology that Jesus teaches. He says the kingdom of heaven is here. It's near. It's this sense of, it's still coming to be fulfilled, but it's also here. Why? Because he has called you and I to be his ambassador. Do you see the picture? It's the same purpose. But here's the thing. It means go be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. But it's not be fruitful merely by biologically reproducing humans. That's why Jesus' commission. Jesus, by the way, a single guy who didn't have any physical, he didn't multiply by reproductive birth. What does he do? He had disciples. And he calls you and I, he says, hey, go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have taught you. What are we saying here? Be fruitful. Go make disciples. Go spread the word and subdue the earth. We're not merely called to one little thing or one thing, but we are called to force the will of the world against itself and into the image of God. I want to tell you this morning, we were made for more. We were made to violently, to violate the will of sin itself and begin to say, hey, no, there is a new creation in Jesus Christ. That when we are reconciled to God, that we might be reconciled to others and we might bring reconciliation into this earth. Through Jesus, our purpose is renewed, restored. And this idea of reconciliation, how many of you know we live in a time where our world desperately needs reconciliation? We live in a time where families need reconciliation. We live in a time where our nation needs reconciliation. And there's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of things going on. And the reality is this. Our reconciliation starts with being reconciled to God. And maybe you're here this morning and you have tried to, you're saying, hey, I've lived a life, I've prayed the prayer, but maybe you're here this morning and you're like, but I'm not living that life of purpose. And maybe you're not fully reconciled to God this morning. It starts with us. Paul says to cast off the new old self. And so maybe you're here this morning and there's still stuff there. We're not going to make it a big thing, but maybe there's still stuff there in your life. Stuff where you're not trusting God for that thing. I would even wager that that's the area where your sense of meaningless comes, that you might feel. And there's something in you that needs to be reconciled to God this morning. That we can first, before we even do any of this other stuff, that we would just cast off the old. Cast off the life where we take matters into our own hands, just like Adam and Eve and all of man before us. All of woman before us. And that we would begin to live into the purpose that God has for you. I don't know what that is. Some of you aren't walking in the purpose God has for you. Because you were made for more. You were made for more than just existing. You were made more for than just wrestling with the discouragement or the hardship. Like, those things are real. I'm not here to say they're not, but I want to tell you were made for more than that. Put off the old self. And you know this, what does the putting on the new self, being this new creation look like? What does it mean to live out our purpose? The beauty is we don't have to come up with what it looks like on our own. See that text we're teaching out of Ephesians 5, it ends with this in the beginning of or verse 4, chapter 4, but it ends in verse 5. It says this. What does it mean to throw off the old and take on the new? It says this, follow God's example. Follow God's example. You want to stop seeing the cycles of brokenness in families? Start following God's example. You want to see reconciliation in your neighborhood or in our country? Start following God's example. You want to see the world transformed? Start following God's example. You want to find purpose in your life? You don't have to change everything. Just start living by the example that Jesus gives us. Jesus came to this earth as a child and lived a life so that we might follow him and he would be our teacher, our rabbi, and we would be like him. Follow God's example. Therefore, following God's example as dearly loved children, walk in the way of love. Just as Christ loves us and gave himself for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. What must we do to be made for more? To live our purpose that God has created us for? Walk the way of love. That we would be like Christ. And it starts with this. Christ did not come to this world to glorify himself. He did not come to this world to establish an earthly kingdom or to find power and prestige. He didn't do it to line his pockets. He didn't do it to get ahead in life. I mean, the man died at 33. Jesus came to this earth to give himself for us, and out of obedience to the Father. He gave himself. See, the real truth is this. You and I find purpose, the purpose that we were made for, when we give ourselves over to the self-giving love of Jesus. And I leave you with this. We're going to sing a song in just a minute. It won't be very long. Are you willing to follow God's example this morning? What is the one thing today, I'm not even going to say this week, what's the one thing you can do that is a self-giving act of love for someone else? Because the reality is, it's not about you. If we want to live our purpose, we must die to ourselves and take on the image of Christ. Would you walk the way of love and give yourself for others? I don't know what that is. Maybe that's your time this weekend. Helping out when we're feeding over 300 families a month. Maybe it's canceling some of those subscriptions that you have, or maybe it's not getting that nice new car and maybe getting something a little bit lower so that you can give to missions and see God do something. It's not about the money. It's about the self-giving love and following the example of Jesus. All of us this day, I don't care whether you don't even believe in Jesus this morning, or you have been a believer all your life and you're like, I got this. All of us have areas where we can give a little bit more to Jesus. There's so many that have given their lives to follow the example of Jesus. If that's you this morning, which it is all of us, that's my challenge to you this morning. Would we build our lives upon the love of God? Would you stand with me this morning?